The chandelier above the grand ballroom cost more than Elena Vasquez would earn in 10 years. She knew this because one of the older waitresses had told her on her first day at the Sterling Hotel. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Elena had served thousands of glasses of champagne to people who never looked her in the eye. Tonight was no different. The charity gala had brought out the wealthiest families in the city. Women wore diamonds that sparkled under the golden lights. Men laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, and Elena moved between them like a ghost, invisible unless someone needed a refill. She was 32 years old. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun, the way the hotel required. Her uniform was perfectly pressed. Her shoes pinched her feet after 6 hours of standing, but she never complained. Complaining didn't pay the bills. Elena had learned a long time ago that survival meant keeping your head down. It meant smiling when you didn't feel like smiling. It meant saying yes, sir, and, of course, ma'am, even when every part of you wanted to say something else. But tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that Elena couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way the guests kept glancing toward the VIP section in the corner. Maybe it was the whispers that floated through the crowd like smoke. "He's here tonight," one of the other waitresses muttered as she passed Elena near the kitchen doors. "Richard Harrington." "Be careful," Elena nodded. She had heard the name before. Everyone who worked at the Sterling had heard stories about Richard Harrington III. He was a real estate billionaire, one of the richest men in the country. He owned hotels, shopping centers, and apartment buildings across a dozen cities. His face appeared in magazines and on television screens. People called him powerful. People called him successful. But the staff at the Sterling called him something else. They called him cruel. There were stories about waiters he had gotten fired for small mistakes. Stories about housekeepers he had screamed at until they cried. One busboy had accidentally spilled water near his table 2 years ago. That busboy lost his job the same night and never worked in hospitality again. Richard Harrington didn't just want respect. He wanted fear. And he had plenty of both. Elena grabbed a fresh tray of champagne glasses and took a deep breath. She just needed to get through the next few hours. Serve the drinks. Avoid the VIP section if possible. Go home. Simple. But life, as Elena had learned many times, rarely followed simple plans. The ballroom was beautiful, she had to admit. The Sterling Hotel was one of the oldest buildings in the city, built over 100 years ago by a family who believed in craftsmanship. The ceiling was painted with scenes from classical stories. The floors were polished marble that reflected the light like still water. And at the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat a grand piano. Elena's eyes lingered on that piano longer than they should have. It was a Steinway, black and gleaming, probably worth more than most people's homes. A small sign next to it announced that a famous pianist was supposed to perform tonight. A special treat for the charity donors. But Elena had overheard the event coordinator panicking earlier. The pianist had canceled at the last minute. Some emergency. The piano would sit untouched all evening. It seemed like such a waste. She forced herself to look away and focus on her work. There were glasses to refill, guests to serve, tips to earn. She couldn't afford to get distracted by beautiful instruments she would never play. Wait. Never play again. That thought caught in her chest like a stone. She pushed it down, the way she always did, and moved through the crowd with her tray held high. The VIP section was roped off with velvet cords, but Elena could see inside clearly. About 15 people sat around a large circular table, their clothes and jewelry announcing their wealth louder than any words could. And at the center of them all sat Richard Harrington. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair combed back perfectly and a face that might have been handsome once. But there was something cold in his eyes, something that made Elena's skin prickle even from a distance. He was telling a story to the group around him, his voice booming, his hands gesturing wildly. Everyone laughed when he paused, whether the joke was funny or not. Elena tried to stay away from that section. She served the tables on the opposite side of the room. She refilled glasses for elderly couples and young executives and everyone in between. For almost 2 hours, she managed to avoid the VIP area completely. Then her manager appeared at her elbow. "Elena, I need you to cover the Harrington table. Diana called in sick, and no one else is available." Elena felt her stomach drop. "Are you sure there's no one else?" Her manager gave her a tired look. "Just keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. You'll be fine." Famous last words. Elena picked up a fresh tray and walked toward the VIP section. Her heart beat a little faster with each step. She reminded herself that she had done this hundreds of times before. Serve the drinks, smile politely, disappear. The velvet rope was pulled aside by a security guard, and Elena stepped into the circle of wealth. She moved around the table, refilling glasses with practiced ease. No one looked at her. No one acknowledged her presence. That was fine. That was exactly what she wanted. She had almost made it around the entire table when she reached Richard Harrington's seat. He was leaning back in his chair, laughing at something one of his friends had said. His champagne glass was nearly empty. Elena reached forward to refill it. Her hand was steady. Her movements were careful. But just as she began to pour, Richard shifted in his seat. His elbow swung outward, and Elena's arm brushed against his sleeve. It was the lightest touch imaginable. Barely a whisper of contact. But Richard Harrington reacted as if she had struck him. He grabbed her wrist. Hard. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was loud enough to cut through every conversation at the table. Loud enough for people at nearby tables to turn and stare. Elena froze. The champagne bottle trembled slightly in her other hand. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Richard's grip tightened. His eyes were cold, and a small smile played at the corner of his lips. He was enjoying this. "Do you have any idea how much this jacket costs?" "More than you make in a year, I'd guess." The table had gone silent. Everyone was watching now. Elena could feel their eyes on her. Some curious, some embarrassed, none willing to speak up. "I apologize, sir," Elena said quietly. "It won't happen again." "You're right, it won't." Richard finally released her wrist and waved his hand dismissively. "I want to speak to your manager. Someone this clumsy shouldn't be serving at an event like this." Elena's face burned, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion only made things worse. Tears were weakness. Anger was insubordination. The only safe response was silence. But Richard wasn't finished. He noticed something as she lowered her hand. He reached out and grabbed her fingers, turning them over to examine them. "What's this?" He rubbed his thumb across her fingertips, feeling the thick calluses there. "Don't tell me you work a second job scrubbing floors somewhere. Or maybe washing dishes?" He laughed and looked around at his friends, inviting them to join the joke. "The help really does work hard, doesn't she?" A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled around the table. Elena pulled her hand back slowly. Those calluses weren't from scrubbing floors. They weren't from washing dishes. They came from something else entirely. Something that Richard Harrington, with all his money and power and cruelty, couldn't begin to understand. But he would learn. Before this night was over, he would learn exactly what those hands could do. Elena stepped back from Richard Harrington's table with her heart pounding in her chest. Her wrist still ached where he had grabbed her. But more than the physical pain, it was the humiliation that stung, the laughter, the looks, the way everyone had watched her like she was entertainment. She retreated to the edge of the ballroom and set her tray down on a service table. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the white tablecloth and took a slow breath. This wasn't the first time a guest had treated her poorly. It wouldn't be the last. She just had to get through the next few hours. Then she could go home to her small apartment, sit at her keyboard, and forget that people like Richard Harrington existed. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The event coordinator stepped onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom. He tapped the microphone twice, and the crowd slowly quieted down. Elena watched from her spot near the wall as he cleared his throat and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. Your generosity will make a tremendous difference for children's hospitals across our region." Polite applause rippled through the room. As many of you know, we had planned a very special musical performance for this evening. Unfortunately, our scheduled pianist had a family emergency and was unable to attend. A murmur of disappointment passed through the crowd. However, the coordinator continued, "We still have this magnificent Steinway on our stage. And I have been told that some of our distinguished guests are quite accomplished musicians themselves. So if anyone would like to volunteer to play a piece or two, please don't be shy." He smiled and gestured toward the gleaming black piano. No one moved. The wealthy guests looked at each other, waiting for someone else to step forward. No one wanted to risk embarrassing themselves in front of their peers. Elena's eyes drifted to the piano again. Her fingers tingled with a familiar ache. How long had it been since she had played a real grand piano? Years. Many years. She had a small electric keyboard in her apartment. The kind that cost less than $200. It was nothing compared to an instrument like that Steinway. Nothing compared to the pianos she used to play when she was young. She pushed the thought away. That was another life. A life that belonged to a different version of herself. From across the room, she heard Richard Harrington's voice rise above the quiet chatter. He was talking to the people at his table, but he was speaking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "A real shame about the pianist," he said, swirling his champagne glass. "Though I suppose it doesn't matter much. Most of these charity events are just excuses for people to show off anyway. The music is usually background noise." One of the women at his table nodded politely. A man in a gray suit chuckled. Richard leaned back in his chair and let his gaze wander across the room. It landed on Elena. She looked away quickly, but it was too late. He had seen her, and something in his expression shifted. "You know what would be amusing?" Richard said, still looking at Elena. "I wonder if anyone on the staff knows how to play." More uncomfortable laughter. Elena felt her face grow warm. She picked up her tray and turned to leave, hoping to disappear into the crowd. But Richard's voice followed her. "You there, waitress." Elena stopped. Every muscle in her body tensed. She turned slowly to face him. "Yes, you," Richard said, waving her over. "Come here for a moment." The ballroom seemed to shrink. Elena could feel dozens of eyes on her as she walked back toward the VIP section. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the velvet rope, the security guard stepped aside without a word. Richard smiled at her. It was not a kind smile. "I was just thinking," he said, loud enough for everyone at surrounding tables to hear. "You have those interesting calluses on your fingers. Maybe you play an instrument." "Do you play an instrument?" Elena's throat tightened. "I used to, sir. A long time ago." "Used to?" Richard raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Well, that's wonderful. What did you play? Guitar? Ukulele? Something from church, perhaps?" "Piano, sir." The word came out before she could stop it. She regretted it immediately. Richard's eyes lit up like a child who had just been given a new toy. "Piano! Did you hear that, everyone? Our waitress here used to play piano." He stood up from his chair, and the movement seemed to command the attention of the entire room. Conversations faded. Heads turned. Even the event coordinator on stage paused to watch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "it seems we may have found our entertainment for the evening after all. This young woman claims she can play piano." Elena shook her head quickly. "I didn't say I could play well. I just said I used to play. It was a long time ago. I'm sure no one wants to." "Nonsense," Richard interrupted. He was enjoying himself now, feeding off the attention. "I think everyone here would love to see a real working-class performance. Something authentic. Something from the heart." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one told Richard to stop. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he produced a thick stack of bills that Elena could tell was more money than she made in several months. "I'll tell you what," Richard said, holding up the cash. If you go up there and play something for us, I'll donate $10,000 to tonight's charity. Right here, right now. All you have to do is sit at that piano and try your best." The room buzzed with whispers. $10,000 was a lot of money. It would help sick children in hospitals. It would make Richard look generous and kind, and it would give everyone in the room a chance to watch a waitress humiliate herself for their amusement. Elena understood exactly what was happening. Richard didn't want to donate to charity. He wanted a show. He wanted to watch her fail. He wanted to prove that people like her didn't belong in rooms like this. Her manager appeared at her side, grabbing her elbow gently. "Elena, just walk away. He's trying to embarrass you. You don't have to do this." $10,000, Richard repeated, louder this time, "for children's hospitals. Unless, of course, you don't actually know how to play. In which case, I understand. Not everyone can be talented." Someone in the crowd snickered. Elena looked at her manager. She looked at Richard. She looked at all the wealthy faces staring at her, waiting to see what the little waitress would do. Her hands were trembling again. But this time, it wasn't from fear or humiliation. It was something else. Something that had been sleeping inside her for a very long time. She thought about all the years she had spent hiding, all the nights she had practiced alone in her tiny apartment, playing with headphones so the neighbors wouldn't complain. All the dreams she had buried because life had gotten too hard and too unfair. She thought about who she used to be, and who she had become. Richard Harrington wanted a show? Fine, she would give him one. Elena pulled her arm gently free from her manager's grip. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I'll do it." The crowd stirred with anticipation. Richard's grin widened. He raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. "Wonderful. Everyone, let's give our volunteer a round of encouragement. I'm sure she'll do her absolute best." Scattered applause filled the room. It was the kind of applause you give to a child about to recite a poem at a school assembly. Polite. Patronizing. Already prepared to be disappointed, Elena set down her serving tray. She smoothed the front of her uniform, and then she began walking toward the stage. Each step echoed in the silence. The grand Steinway waited for her under the golden lights, black and perfect and worth more than anything she had ever owned. The bench sat empty. Behind her, Richard Harrington whispered something to his friends. They laughed softly. They wouldn't be laughing for long. The walk from the VIP section to the stage was only about 50 feet, but to Elena, it felt like a mile. Every step seemed to happen in slow motion. She could hear the rustle of expensive fabric as people turned in their chairs to watch her. She could feel their eyes on her back, judging, curious, waiting. The whispers followed her like shadows. Is she really going to do it? This should be interesting. Poor thing. She has no idea what she's getting into. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the piano. It sat there under the lights, gleaming and perfect, like something from a dream she had given up on years ago. The Steinway logo caught the golden light from the chandeliers above. She knew that logo well. She had played on instruments just like this one, back when her life was completely different, back when she was someone else entirely. Her mind drifted as she walked, pulling her into memories she usually kept locked away. She was 6 years old again, sitting on a wooden bench in her grandmother's house, in a small town outside Madrid. Her grandmother had an old, upright piano, scratched and out of tune. But to little Elena, it was the most magical thing in the world. She remembered pressing the keys for the first time, amazed that her tiny fingers could create sound. Her grandmother had laughed and clapped her hands. "You have music in your blood," her grandmother had said. "I can see it already." She was 10 years old, practicing scales at the conservatory while other children played outside. Her teacher was strict, demanding, never satisfied. But Elena didn't mind. The piano was her escape. When she played, nothing else existed. No schoolwork, no worries, no sadness, just the music, and her fingers, and the feeling of flying. She was 16 years old, standing on a stage in Vienna, taking a bow after her first international performance. The crowd was on their feet. Roses landed at her shoes. A newspaper the next day called her a prodigy. a rising star, a future legend. Her mother had cried with pride. Her father had hugged her so tight she could barely breathe. That was the happiest night of her life. And then everything fell apart. Elena pushed the memories down as she reached the edge of the stage. 3 small steps led up to the platform where the piano waited. She climbed them slowly, aware that every person in the ballroom was watching her. On the far side of the room, Richard Harrington leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. His smile was wide and cruel. He had already won, in his mind. He was already imagining her sitting at the piano, fumbling through some simple tune, embarrassing herself in front of hundreds of wealthy strangers. He had no idea who she was. None of them did, and maybe that was her own fault. Maybe she had spent too many years hiding, too many years being invisible, too many years telling herself that the girl who played in Vienna was gone forever. But that girl wasn't gone. She was just buried. Buried under years of struggle and grief and survival. Buried under waitress uniforms and unpaid bills. And nights spent crying alone in a tiny apartment. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, that girl wanted to come out. Elena reached the piano and stood beside it. She let her fingers brush lightly against the polished surface. The wood was smooth and cool. She could smell the faint scent of polish and age. This instrument had been cared for, loved, played by masters. She wondered if they had ever faced a moment like this. Probably not. Masters didn't serve champagne to billionaires. Masters didn't get their wrists grabbed and their dignity stripped away for entertainment. But masters also didn't give up. And despite everything, despite all the years and all the pain, Elena had never truly given up. She had just been waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. Maybe she had been waiting for tonight. She pulled out the bench and sat down. The height was wrong, so she adjusted it carefully, the way her teacher had taught her 30 years ago. The bench slid smoothly on its tracks until it was perfect. Her feet found the pedals below. Her knees were the right distance from the keys. Muscle memory. It never really goes away. The room had fallen completely silent. Elena could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. She could hear someone cough near the back of the ballroom. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She placed her hands on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. For a moment, she was back in Vienna. 16 years old. Standing ovation. Roses at her feet. Her whole life ahead of her. Then she was back in the hospital room, holding her mother's hand as the machines beeped slower and slower. The accident had taken her father instantly. Her mother lasted 3 more days. Elena sat by her bed the entire time, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to understand how the world could be so cruel. Then she was back in the physical therapy clinic, learning how to use her left hand again after the tendons were damaged in that same accident. The doctors said she might never play professionally again. The insurance money ran out. The invitations stopped coming. The rising star became a forgotten name. Then she was back in her apartment, working her first job as a waitress at 24 years old, crying into her pillow every night because she didn't know who she was anymore. Then she was here, sitting at a $200,000 piano in front of people who thought she was nothing. People who would never know what she had lost. People who would never understand what it cost her just to sit on this bench. Elena opened her eyes. The ballroom stretched out before her, filled with faces she didn't recognize. Wealthy faces. Curious faces. Some looked bored, already expecting disappointment. Some looked amused, ready to laugh at her failure. A few looked uncomfortable, perhaps sensing that something wasn't quite right. Richard Harrington was whispering something to the woman beside him. They both chuckled softly. Elena's manager stood near the service entrance, her hands clasped together, her face tight with worry. The event coordinator hovered near the edge of the stage, unsure whether to intervene. None of them mattered. Not anymore. Elena looked down at the keys, 88 of them, stretching out in their perfect pattern of black and white. She knew every single one. She knew exactly what sound each would make. She knew how to make them sing, how to make them cry, how to make them tell stories that words could never capture. She had spent 15 years being invisible. 15 years serving drinks and cleaning tables and pretending that the music inside her didn't exist. 15 years surviving instead of living. Tonight, that ended. She thought about what piece to play. Something simple would be safe. A basic melody that anyone could manage. Something that would satisfy Richard's cruel game without revealing too much. But Elena was tired of being safe. She was tired of hiding. She was tired of letting people like Richard Harrington decide what she was worth. So she chose something else. Something that would tell them exactly who she was. Her fingers found their positions. Left hand ready on the lower keys. Right hand poised above the upper register. Her back straightened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath steadied. The first note hung in the air for a moment, pure and perfect. Then the second note followed. Then the third. Then a cascade of sound that made several people in the front row gasp out loud. Richard Harrington's smile began to fade. Elena Vasquez began to play. The music poured out of Elena like water breaking through a dam. Years of silence, years of hiding, years of pretending she was nobody special. All of it released in a flood of sound that filled every corner of the grand ballroom. She had chosen Chopin's Ballade. No, 1-inch G minor. It was not a piece for beginners. It was not a piece for amateurs. It was a work that professional pianists approached with respect and sometimes fear. The ballade demanded everything from a performer: technical precision, emotional depth, complete control and complete surrender at the same time. Elena gave it everything she had. Her fingers danced across the keys with a speed and accuracy that made jaws drop throughout the room. The opening notes were soft and haunting, like a whisper from another world. Then the melody built, layer upon layer, growing more complex with each passing measure. In the VIP section, Richard Harrington's champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. His smug expression flickered. Something was wrong. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't what he had planned. The waitress wasn't fumbling. She wasn't struggling through a simple tune. She was playing like someone who had trained for decades. She was playing like a master. People in the front rows began to lean forward in their seats. A woman in a red dress pressed her hand to her chest. An older gentleman removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. The music was doing something to them. It was reaching inside and touching places they had forgotten existed. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back on the stage in Vienna, 17 years old, performing this same piece for the first time in competition. She remembered the nerves, the excitement, the feeling that anything was possible. She remembered how the music had lifted her up and carried her away, how for 12 perfect minutes nothing else in the world mattered. She was back in her grandmother's living room, playing on that old upright piano while the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Her grandmother sat in a worn armchair nearby, eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her face. The music connected them in ways that words never could. She was back in the hospital, 3 days after the accident, with bandages wrapped around her left hand and grief wrapped around her heart. A physical therapist had asked her what she did for a living. When she said she was a pianist, he had looked at her hand and said nothing. His silence told her everything she needed to know. But he was wrong. They were all wrong. The doctors who said she might never play professionally again. The agents who stopped returning her calls. The conservatory friends who drifted away because they didn't know what to say. The whole world that had written her off as a tragic story with no happy ending. They were all wrong. Elena's left hand moved across the bass keys with power and precision that should have been impossible. Years of secret practice had rebuilt what the accident had tried to destroy. Night after night, alone in her tiny apartment, she had worked to bring her damaged hand back to life. No audience, no applause, just her and the music and a stubborn refusal to give up. The ballade reached its stormy middle section. The notes came faster and faster, crashing like waves against rocks. Elena's whole body moved with the music. Her shoulders swayed. Her head tilted. Her feet worked the pedals with perfect timing. In the audience, people had stopped pretending this was just background entertainment. Forks rested on plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place by the power of what they were hearing. A music producer named Chen Wei stood near the back of the room. He had come to the gala hoping to network with potential investors. Instead, he found himself unable to move, unable to look away from the woman at the piano. In 30 years of working in the music industry, he had heard many talented performers. But this was something different. This was someone who played with the passion of a person who had lost everything and found it again. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Richard Harrington sat in his chair like a man turned to stone. The color had drained from his face. His friends glanced at him nervously, unsure what to say. The joke had turned sour. The entertainment had become something else entirely. One of the women at his table leaned over and whispered, "Richard, did you know she could play like this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Richard Harrington had nothing to say. The ballade moved into its final section. The melody became tender again, heartbreaking in its beauty. Elena thought of her mother and father. She thought of all the years she had spent running from this part of herself. She thought of every time she had told herself that the girl who played in Vienna was dead. But that girl wasn't dead. She had just been sleeping. And now, finally, she was awake. The last notes of the Chopin faded into silence. Elena let her hands rest on the keys for a moment, head bowed, breathing heavily. The piece had taken everything out of her. She felt empty and full at the same time. The silence lasted for 3 long seconds. Then the ballroom erupted. The applause was like thunder. People rose from their seats, one after another, until the entire room was standing. Some people cheered. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. An elderly woman in the front row was openly weeping, clutching her husband's arm. But Elena wasn't finished. She looked up at the audience for the first time since she had started playing. Her eyes found Richard Harrington in the VIP section. He was standing with the rest, clapping slowly, his face a mask of forced politeness. She wanted him to know. She wanted all of them to know. Her hands returned to the keys. The applause faded as people realized she was about to play again. They sat back down, eager and curious. This time, Elena chose Liszt, La Campanella, one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. It was famous for destroying the confidence of lesser pianists. The right hand was required to make jumps of more than an octave at lightning speed, over and over, for nearly 5 minutes straight. Professional musicians practiced it for years before attempting it in public. Elena launched into it without hesitation. The notes rang out like bells, bright and impossibly fast. Her right hand flew across the upper keys while her left provided a steady foundation below. It was acrobatics. It was magic. It was the kind of performance that made other pianists want to quit. The audience watched in stunned silence. This was no longer entertainment. This was revelation. This waitress, this server, this woman they had all looked past and ignored, was one of the finest pianists any of them had ever heard. When the final note of La Campanella rang out, the silence was even longer this time. 5 full seconds of complete stillness. Then the room exploded again. The standing ovation was louder than before. People stamped their feet. People called out for more. The event coordinator stood near the stage with tears streaming down his face. Elena's manager had collapsed into a chair, her hand over her mouth, unable to process what she had just witnessed. And in the VIP section, Richard Harrington stood motionless. His face was pale. His champagne sat untouched. He looked like a man who had just realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Elena rose from the piano bench and turned to face the crowd. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She just stood there, letting them see her. Really see her. Not the waitress, not the hired help, but the woman she had always been underneath, the woman she would never hide again. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Elena stood beside the piano, her hands trembling slightly, her heart still racing from the performance. She had given everything she had. For the first time in 15 years, she had shown the world who she really was. And the world was responding. People began leaving their tables and walking toward the stage. Not to get drinks, not to use the restroom. They were coming to see her, to talk to her, to understand how a waitress in a black uniform had just delivered one of the most stunning piano performances they had ever witnessed. The first to reach her was an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She took Elena's hands in her own and held them gently. "My dear," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in 50 years. Who are you? Where did you come from?" Before Elena could answer, more people surrounded her. They asked questions. They offered compliments. They wanted to know her name, her background, her story. A few pulled out their phones and asked for photographs. Elena felt dizzy. This was too much, too fast. For so long, she had been invisible. Now suddenly, everyone wanted to see her. Through the crowd, she spotted a man in a dark blue suit making his way toward the stage. He moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on her. When he reached the front, he waited patiently until the others had stepped back slightly. "Miss," he said, extending his hand. "My name is Chen Wei. I'm a music producer. I've worked with orchestras and recording artists across 3 continents." Elena shook his hand slowly. "Hello. I recorded your performance on my phone," Chen Wei continued. "I hope you don't mind. I've never heard anything quite like it. The emotion, the technique, the way you command the instrument, it's extraordinary." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I would like to discuss a recording contract with you. Nothing pressured, nothing rushed. But I believe you have a gift that the world deserves to hear. Please call me when you're ready." Elena took the card. Her fingers felt numb. A recording contract. Those were words she had stopped dreaming about years ago. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Chen Wei smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything tonight. Just think about it. And know that whatever you decide, what you did up there was remarkable." He stepped back into the crowd, leaving Elena holding the small white card like it was made of gold. The event coordinator appeared at her side, his face still flushed with excitement. "Miss Vasquez, I don't even know where to begin. That was incredible. I've been organizing events at this hotel for 12 years, and I have never seen a reaction like this." He glanced around the room, then leaned closer. "Several guests have already asked about booking you for private performances. And the charity donations have more than tripled in the last half hour. People are giving money just because of what you did tonight." Elena let out a small laugh. It sounded strange to her own ears. "I was just supposed to serve champagne." "Well," the coordinator said with a grin, "I think your serving days might be over." Across the ballroom, Elena noticed movement near the VIP section. Richard Harrington was trying to leave. He had gathered his jacket and was walking quickly toward the exit, his head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. But people were watching him now. And they were not watching with admiration. The whispers had already started spreading through the crowd. Word traveled fast at events like this. Everyone knew that Richard Harrington had tried to humiliate a waitress. Everyone knew he had mocked her calloused fingers and offered money to watch her fail. And everyone had just seen that waitress deliver a performance worthy of the greatest concert halls in the world. Richard's cruelty had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making himself look powerful, he had made himself look small. Elena watched him move toward the door. Part of her wanted to let him go. Part of her wanted to forget about him entirely and focus on this strange, wonderful new chapter that seemed to be opening in her life. But another part of her needed to say something. Not for revenge, not for anger, just for herself. Just to close a door that had been open for too long. She stepped down from the stage and walked across the ballroom. People parted to let her through. By the time she reached Richard, he was almost at the exit. "Mr. Harrington." He stopped, his shoulders tensed. Slowly, he turned to face her. The room had gone quiet again. Everyone was watching. Elena looked at the man who had grabbed her wrist. The man who had mocked her in front of hundreds of people. The man who had been so certain that she was nothing. She kept her voice calm and clear. "Was that entertaining enough for you?" The silence stretched out. Richard's face went through several expressions. Embarrassment. Anger. Something that might have been shame. His mouth opened, But no words came out. Finally, he turned and walked out the door without saying a word. The crowd erupted in murmurs and a few scattered cheers. Elena didn't watch him leave. She had already given him more attention than he deserved. Her manager rushed over, tears in her eyes. "Elena, I had no idea. All these years, you never said anything. Why didn't you tell anyone?" Elena thought about the question for a moment. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "I was afraid that if I tried and failed, I would lose the only thing I had left. So I stopped trying. I told myself it was safer to hide." She looked around the ballroom at all the faces watching her. Some curious, some amazed, some still wiping away tears. "But hiding isn't living," she continued. "I think I forgot that for a while." Over the next week, Elena's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. The video Chen Wei had recorded went viral online. Within 3 days, it had been viewed over 10 million times. News outlets picked up the story. The waitress who stunned a billionaire. The hidden piano prodigy. The comeback no one saw coming. Invitations poured in from everywhere: concert halls, television shows, music festivals. A famous orchestra in New York invited her to perform as a guest soloist. A foundation for young musicians asked her to become an ambassador. The Sterling Hotel offered her a new position. Not as a waitress, but as their featured performer. She would play in the grand ballroom every weekend, at the same piano where everything had changed. Elena accepted that offer first. It felt right. It felt like coming full circle. On her first official night as a performer, she arrived at the hotel in a simple black dress instead of a uniform. She walked through the lobby where she had once carried trays of champagne. She climbed the same small steps to the same stage. The ballroom was packed. People had come from all over the city to hear her play. In the front row sat her manager, now her biggest supporter. A few rows back sat Chen Wei, who had already begun planning her first album. Elena sat down at the Steinway and let her fingers rest on the keys. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about her parents. She thought about all the years of struggle and silence. Then she thought about the future. And for the first time in a very long time, it looked bright. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time, she wasn't hiding. This time, the whole world was listening. And Elena Vasquez was finally home.